The year was 1968, and inside the glass tower of the General Motors Technical Center in Warren, Michigan, the most powerful man in the American automobile industry was standing over a drafting table on a Saturday morning. He was not supposed to be there. He was the president of the largest corporation on the face of the earth. His name was Edward Nicholas Cole, and he was sketching an engine. Not just any engine. He was sketching what he believed would be the future of the American automobile. A small, lightweight, all-aluminum four-cylinder block that would power a car so cheap, so efficient, so brilliantly engineered that it would crush the imported Volkswagen Beetles and Datsuns that were swarming into the country like mechanical locusts. He wanted a world beater, and he wanted it in showrooms in 24 months. The engineers who worked under him watched from a distance. They knew the look. They had seen it before. Ed Cole had the same gleam in his eyes that he had when he designed the legendary small-block Chevrolet V8 in 1955, the engine that became the heartbeat of America for half a century. But they also knew something that Cole did not seem to register. They knew that what he was drawing on that drafting table was not a masterpiece. It was a bomb, and when it finally exploded, it would not just destroy a car, it would crack the foundation of General Motors itself and open a wound in American manufacturing that would bleed for decades. The story of the Chevrolet Vega is not really a story about a car. It is a story about what happens when the most brilliant engineer in the room becomes the most powerful executive in the building. It is a story about how a single decision made in haste, driven by ego and corporate panic, can ripple outward until it reshapes the fate of an entire industry. It is the story of a tiny aluminum engine block, no bigger than a suitcase, that brought the mightiest industrial machine in human history to its knees. To understand why Ed Cole was in that drafting room on a Saturday, you have to understand the fear that was creeping through the corridors of General Motors in the late 1960s. For decades, GM had owned America. They sold nearly half of every car purchased in the United States. Their factories stretched across the Midwest like a steel spine. Their workers numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The company was so dominant, so unassailable, that its internal politics had become more intense than its competition with other automakers. Divisions fought divisions. Engineers fought accountants. The enemy was not Ford or Chrysler. The enemy was the guy in the office down the hall. But a new threat had arrived. It was small, it was cheap, and it came from overseas. The Volkswagen Beetle had gone from being a curiosity to a cultural phenomenon. Japanese cars from Toyota and Datsun were landing at the ports of Los Angeles and San Francisco in growing numbers. They were ugly by American standards, they were tiny, but they were cheap to buy, cheap to run, and they did not break down every 6 months. The American consumer, especially the young American consumer, was starting to ask a dangerous question. Why am I paying $3,000 for a car that drinks gasoline like water when I can pay $1,500 for a car that sips? GM Chairman James Roche saw the numbers. He saw the import share climbing year after year, and in 1968 he made an announcement that would set the catastrophe in motion. General Motors would build an all-new American subcompact car. It would be engineered from scratch. It would feature new technology. It would be priced to compete directly with the Beetle, and it would be in dealerships in 2 years. 2 years to design an entirely new car from the wheels up, to engineer a brand new engine, to build a brand new factory, to train a brand new workforce. In the normal rhythm of automotive development, this would take 4 years minimum. Roche was asking for a miracle, and Ed Cole, the man who had performed miracles before, raised his hand and said he would deliver it. Cole was not a reckless man by nature. He was a genius. That was the problem. He had risen through the ranks of General Motors on the strength of one engine, the small-block V8, a design so elegant, so reliable, so perfectly suited to the American appetite for power that it remained in production for decades. It made him famous. It put him on the cover of Time magazine. It carried him from the engineering floor to the presidency of the corporation. But somewhere between the drafting table and the executive suite, something shifted inside Ed Cole. The engineer who once obsessed over tolerances and testing became a man obsessed with speed and spectacle. He wanted to prove that GM could still innovate. He wanted to prove that he, personally, could still create. So he took personal control of the engine program. Not oversight, control. He showed up at the engineering staff drafting room on Saturdays, reviewing drawings, directing changes, overruling his own engineers with the authority of the presidency behind him. The Chevrolet engineers who were supposed to be building this engine watched in frustration as their own designs were rejected. They had proposed a conventional iron block four-cylinder. It was heavier, yes, but it was proven. It was reliable. It was the kind of engine that a man could drive for 100,000 miles without cracking. Cole dismissed it. He wanted aluminum. He wanted innovation. He wanted a die-cast aluminum block manufactured using a process jointly developed with Reynolds Metals and Sealed Power Corporation. The block would use no steel cylinder liners. Instead, the cylinder walls themselves would be made of a special silicon aluminum alloy, etched with acid to expose microscopic silicon crystals that would serve as the bearing surface for the pistons. It was technically brilliant. It was the kind of engineering that wins awards in a laboratory. But in the real world, in the hands of ordinary Americans who forgot to check their coolant and drove their cars until the temperature gauge was in the red, it was a death sentence. The fatal flaw was simple physics, the same force that has destroyed more engineering dreams than any competitor. The engine block was aluminum, the cylinder head was cast iron. Aluminum and iron expand at different rates when they get hot. When the engine overheated, and it would overheat because Cole had insisted that the car did not even need a radiator, that the heater core alone could handle the cooling, the aluminum block would expand faster than the iron head. The head gasket would fail, coolant would seep into the cylinders, and without steel liners to protect the bore walls, the damage was catastrophic and irreversible. The engine did not just break, it destroyed itself. The engineers knew this. They begged for a larger radiator. They begged for an all-aluminum cylinder head that would expand at the same rate as the block. They had designed one, a beautiful cross-flow head with hemispherical combustion chambers, lighter and more efficient than the iron unit. Prototypes were built. Manufacturing tooling was started. But it was not approved for production. It cost too much. The accountants killed it, and Cole did not fight them because the clock was ticking and the deadline was sacred. After many prototype failures, a radiator was finally added to the car, but it was the smallest radiator anyone had ever seen in a production automobile. 12 inches by 12 inches, a square foot of cooling capacity for an engine that ran hotter than its designers had predicted. The engineers in the closed offices began calling it the world's tallest, smallest engine. It was not a compliment, it was a eulogy. The car was named Vega, after the brightest star in the constellation Lyra. It went on sale in September of 1970, and for a brief shining moment, it looked like Cole had pulled off another miracle. Motor Trend magazine awarded it Car of the Year. The styling was sharp, almost like a miniature Camaro. The handling was praised. The price was competitive. Chevrolet dealers could not keep them on the lot. The orders flooded in and the brand-new factory in Lordstown, Ohio cranked into gear. Lordstown was supposed to be the future of American manufacturing. It sat in the flat, wind-blasted farmland of northeast Ohio, just outside Youngstown, a brand-new colossus of steel and concrete built with the most advanced automation General Motors had ever deployed. The plant was a cathedral of efficiency. Robotic arms welded body panels, conveyor systems threaded through the building like the circulatory system of some massive mechanical organism. And at the center of it all was the assembly line. It ran at 100 cars per hour. That was nearly double the speed of a typical assembly plant. Most factories in America produced 55 vehicles per hour. Lordstown was designed to produce nearly twice that. Each worker had 36 seconds to complete their task before the next car arrived. 36 seconds. Not a minute, not 45 seconds. 36. To stand inside that plant was to feel the vibration of the future in the soles of your boots. The noise was relentless. The air smelled of welding flux and paint primer and the chemical tang of freshly molded interior plastic. The cars moved past the workers in an unbroken river of metal, each one demanding that every bolt be tightened, every wire be connected, every panel be aligned before the next one arrived and the whole process started again. The workforce at Lordstown was young. The average age was 24. They had long hair and bell-bottom trousers and mustaches that their fathers would have considered undisciplined. They were the best-educated generation of factory workers in American history. They had been to college. They had marched against the war. They had been told by their teachers and their culture that they were individuals with rights and voices. These were not the old Union men who had spent their lives building Impalas and accepted the monotony as the price of a middle-class life. These were baby boomers. They questioned authority the way their lungs drew air, automatically, reflexively, without even thinking about it. And then they walked into a factory that treated them like extensions of the machine, interchangeable parts in a system that had no interest in their opinions, their creativity, or their humanity. When the General Motors Assembly Division took over the plant in the fall of 1971, they laid off 300 workers and spread their tasks among the remaining crew. The line speed stayed at 100 cars an hour. The workload per person increased. The disciplinary measures tightened. And the workers responded in a way that would become legendary. They fought back. Not with speeches, not with petitions, with their hands. They fought back with sabotage that was as creative as it was destructive. Workers let cars pass down the line without completing their work. Doors were left unbolted. Wiring harnesses were left unconnected. Paint was deliberately scratched. Upholstery was slashed with razor blades. Bolts and screws were dropped inside door panels where they would rattle for the life of the car. A tiny mechanical ghost haunting every driver who would never know why their new Chevrolet sounded like it was full of loose change. The repair lots behind the factory swelled. Hundreds, then thousands of Vegas sat under the Ohio sky, technically complete, but functionally ruined, waiting for teams of mechanics to undo the damage that the assembly line workers had done in protest. In the first few months after the takeover, over 5,000 formal grievances were filed. Absenteeism hit 20% on Mondays and Fridays. A worker named J.D. Smith, the treasurer of the local union, said something that captured the entire generation in a single sentence. They are just not going to swallow the same kind of treatment their fathers did. They want more than just a job for 30 years. One worker described the feeling in words that sound less like a labor grievance and more like an existential crisis. You do it automatically, like a monkey or a dog would do something by conditioning. You feel stagnant. Everything is over and over and over. It seems like your whole purpose in life is to do this operation. On March 4, 1972, 97% of the workers voted to strike. 7,500 women and men walked into the cold Ohio night. At each of the 4 entrances, clusters of workers lit bonfires against the dark. The banners inside the plant, the corporate slogans that read, "Product excellence makes our jobs more secure," and "Quality keeps everybody happy," hung over a silent, empty factory floor. The Lordstown strike lasted 18 days and cost General Motors $150 million in lost production. The New York Times covered it. The Senate held hearings on worker alienation. The phrase Lordstown syndrome entered the American vocabulary, a clinical term for the sickness of a generation that refused to be ground down by a machine. But the cost that could not be calculated, the cost that no accountant could put in a ledger, was the damage done to the Vega itself. The cars that had rolled off the line during the months of labor unrest were assembled with indifference at best and contempt at worst. The buyers who drove them off the lot discovered that the car which Motor Trend had called the best of the year was falling apart in their driveways. As one Lordstown worker put it with brutal honesty, "I would hate to buy one." And then the engine started dying. The reports came in slowly at first, a trickle, then a stream, then a flood. A Vega in Phoenix that overheated on the highway and never recovered. The owner pulled over on the shoulder of Interstate 10, popped the hood, and watched steam pour from the tiny radiator like a boiling kettle. A Vega in Cleveland that started burning oil at 8,000 miles, leaving a blue haze in the garage every morning and a dark stain on the driveway. A Vega in Dallas where the engine seized completely at 12,000 miles, the pistons welded to the cylinder walls as permanently as if someone had poured concrete into the block. The dealers were the first to understand the scope of the disaster. They were the ones standing in the service bays, watching the mechanics pull the cylinder heads off these aluminum blocks and staring at the scored, gouged, destroyed cylinder walls underneath. The silicone aluminum alloy that was supposed to provide a miraculously smooth bearing surface had failed. The thin iron plating on the pistons had worn through. Coolant had seeped past the warped head gaskets and entered the cylinders, washing away the thin film of oil that was the only thing standing between function and catastrophe. The mechanics would run their fingers along the inside of the bore and feel grooves deep enough to catch a fingernail. There was nothing to do. You could not rebore the cylinders. There were no liners to replace. The block was garbage, a throwaway. The only fix was a new engine. And General Motors, under a revised 50,000-mile engine warranty, was forced to provide them. The cost was staggering. By 1972, General Motors had issued 3 massive recalls. By the third recall, 95% of all Vegas manufactured before May of 1972 had critical safety flaws. The list of defects read like an indictment. Engines were backfiring so violently through the exhaust system that the shock waves ruptured the mufflers. The hot gases that spilled out then heated the adjacent fuel tank until the metal expanded and split, pouring gasoline onto the ground beneath a car that was already on fire. The throttle linkage was jamming open because a bracket in the emission control system was falling into the mechanism. Imagine driving on a highway and your accelerator locks at full throttle. Now imagine that this was happening to hundreds of thousands of cars. The axles were separating from the rear end. The front end of the very first prototype had separated after just 8 miles on the GM test track, requiring 20 pounds of emergency structural reinforcements before anyone outside the company ever sat in one. And the body panels were rusting. The rust-proofing process that was supposed to protect the car had not been applied to the entire chassis. In the Salt Belt states of the North, where the roads were coated in brine every winter, Vegas were dissolving like sugar cubes dropped in water. Fender panels rotted through in 2 years. Rocker panels crumbled. The car that was named after a star was returning to the earth faster than anyone imagined. The consumer backlash was devastating. The Vega, advertised on television and in glossy magazine spreads as the little car that does everything well, had become a national joke. Mechanics called it a guaranteed return customer. Owners formed informal support groups, trading tips on how to keep the engine alive past 20,000 miles, how to slow the rust, how to live with a car that seemed designed to punish the people who bought it. But the anger went deeper than frustration with a faulty product. It was a crisis of faith. General Motors was not just a car company, it was the symbol of American industrial supremacy. "What is good for General Motors is good for the country," a former GM president had once said, and for decades that had felt true. If you could not trust GM to build a car that lasted, then what could you trust? The Vega cracked something in the American consumer that had never been cracked before. The belief that the biggest, most powerful, most technologically advanced company in the world would not sell you something that destroyed itself from the inside out. The betrayal felt personal. It felt like a lie told by a family member, and lies from family are the ones that leave the deepest scars. The overheating problems grew so severe that they eventually triggered congressional hearings in 1978. Senators and representatives who had never looked inside an engine block were now asking questions about aluminum thermal expansion rates and silicon bore technology. The aluminum engine that Ed Cole had sketched on that Saturday morning, the engine that was supposed to save General Motors from the imports, the engine that was supposed to prove that American innovation could still lead the world, had become the most infamous power plant in automotive history. Cole retired from General Motors in 1974. He never publicly acknowledged the scope of the disaster. He moved on to become chairman of Checker Rotors Corporation and pursued his next obsession, a private air freight company. In May of 1977, flying his own twin-engine plane through fog and rain near Kalamazoo, Michigan, he became disoriented and crashed. He was 67 years old. The man who had designed the greatest American engine of the 20th century, and also its worst, was dead, taken by the same impulse that had defined his career, the belief that he could pilot anything through any storm if he just held the controls tightly enough. The Vega limped on until 1977. In its 7-year life, Chevrolet sold nearly 2 million of them, a number that sounds like success until you understand that each one was a small grenade lobbed into the reputation of American manufacturing. The damage was not confined to a single model. It was systemic. It was generational. The Vega proved to the American public that Detroit could not build a small car. It confirmed the suspicion, whispered at first, and then shouted, that Japanese and German engineers cared about quality in a way that American executives did not. And here is the cruelest irony of the entire story. The imports that Ed Cole was trying to destroy with the Vega were not technically superior. The early Toyotas and Datsuns had their own problems. They rusted just as badly in the northern states. Their heaters were weak, their interiors were Spartan, but they had one thing that the Vega did not. They worked. The engines started every morning, they did not overheat on the freeway, they did not seize at 12,000 miles. They were not exciting, they were not innovative, they were not the work of a genius. They were the work of patient, methodical engineers who tested their designs until the problems were found and fixed before the customer ever turned the key. Every Toyota Corolla sold in 1975, every Honda Civic that rolled off the lot in 1976 owed a small debt of gratitude to the Chevrolet Vega for proving that the customer was right to look elsewhere. The Vega did not just fail to stop the imports, it held the door open for them. It handed them the keys to the American market and said, "Here, take it. We do not deserve it anymore." The Lordstown plant survived the Vega. It went on to build the Cavalier, the Cobalt, the Cruze, a succession of small cars that were always a little better than the Vega, but never quite good enough to erase its ghost. The workers at Lordstown never forgot what happened in 1972. The phrase Lordstown Syndrome entered the American vocabulary as shorthand for the alienation of the industrial worker, the human cost of treating people like extensions of a machine. Sociologists studied it. The Senate held hearings about it. A presidential commission produced a report that said what the workers had been screaming all along, that many workers at all occupational levels feel locked in, their mobility blocked, the opportunity to grow lacking in their jobs, challenge missing from their tasks. The plant finally closed in 2019, 53 years after it opened, its last 1,500 workers walking out into a parking lot in Northeast Ohio, carrying the same sense of betrayal that their grandfathers had felt on the picket line in 1972. The farmland that GM had purchased in 1955 for a factory of the future became a relic of the past, sold to companies that promised electric trucks and then went bankrupt themselves. The cycle of promise and failure continued, as if the land itself had been cursed by the ghost of a little car named after a star. And General Motors never fully recovered, not from the Vega specifically, but from the culture that produced it. The same organizational arrogance, the same belief that brilliance at the top could overcome incompetence in execution, the same refusal to listen to the engineers on the floor who were waving red flags that no one wanted to see. These same patterns repeated themselves decade after decade. The Oldsmobile diesel in the early 1980s, an aluminum block disaster that echoed the Vega almost note for note. The Cadillac HT4100, another aluminum experiment that warped and failed in the same way, as if the company had learned nothing at all. The ignition switch scandal decades later, where a defect known internally for years was buried until people died. The Vega was not an isolated failure. It was the first visible crack in a dam that is still leaking today. If you could go back to that Saturday morning in 1968 and stand behind Ed Cole as he bent over his drafting table, you would see a man drawing the future. He was drawing an engine that was lighter than anything Detroit had ever built. He was drawing innovation. He was drawing ambition. He was drawing the confidence of a man who had already changed the world once and believed, with the unshakable certainty of a prophet, that he could do it again. But he was also drawing hubris. He was drawing a man so in love with his own vision that he could not hear the voices around him warning that the foundation was not strong enough, that the cooling system was too small, that the timeline was too short, that the customers were not engineers and would not treat this fragile experimental machine with the surgical precision it demanded. He was drawing a lesson that America would learn again and again in the decades that followed, that speed kills. Not just on the highway, but in the boardroom. That the pressure to be first can destroy the chance to be right. The Chevrolet Vega was not killed by bad engineering. The concept was sound. The technology was real. The same linerless aluminum cylinder technology that failed in the Vega went on to be used with near-perfect reliability for decades by Mercedes-Benz, Porsche, and BMW. The same basic principle powers engines in some of the finest cars on the road today. The difference was not the idea. The difference was time. The difference was testing. The difference was the willingness to delay a launch until the product was ready, to accept a quarter of lost revenue rather than a decade of lost trust. The difference was the humility to admit that a 24-month deadline was not a challenge to be conquered, but a trap to be avoided. Ed Cole did not have that patience. General Motors did not have that patience. America in 1968, racing to the moon, fighting a war across the ocean, tearing itself apart over civil rights in Vietnam, did not have that patience. Everyone wanted the future now, delivered in 24 months, priced at $2,000, rolling off the fastest assembly line in the world at 100 units per hour. And what they got was a beautiful, cursed, star-named machine that ate its own cylinders alive and taught a generation of Americans that the biggest company in the world could also be the most careless. The wind blows through the empty lot where the Lordstown plant once stood, kicking up dust where the fastest assembly line in the world used to scream at 100 cars an hour. The aluminum engine that was supposed to save General Motors from the rising tide of imports sits in a few museums now, cross-sectioned and labeled, a teaching tool for engineering students who learn from it the oldest lesson in manufacturing. It does not matter how brilliant the design is if you do not give it time to breathe. It does not matter how fast the line runs if the men on the line have lost the will to care. And it does not matter how bright the star is if the fuel that feeds it is burning too hot and too fast. The brightest star in the constellation burned the hottest, and the hottest stars are always the first to burn out.